This is how baseball players are supposed to start dressing this year. Hello everyone, I'm Joe, this is Same Name Different Game, and welcome to 2020. And what better way to usher in 2020 than with a game that purported to show us the future of America's pastime 30 years ago. Super Baseball 2020. Or maybe it's 2020 Super Baseball. I've actually seen it written both ways, and the logo itself is ambiguous enough that I don't know which is correct. It really could be either. All I'm certain of is that it's not Super 2020 Baseball, but enough about the title. Let's dive in with a little history. I've talked a bit about the Neo Geo itself in the past, and plan to more in the future, but if you're unawares, the system was meant to be a merging of home and arcade hardware, with what amounted to relatively cheap arcade setups and an extremely expensive home console. But what made it work is that both systems played the same games. No corners were cut, no porting was done. What you saw in the arcade is what you would play at home, if you drop the $650 asking price for the system. Yeah, $650, over 3 times what a brand new Super NES cost in 1991. And what's crazy is a majority of Neo Geo games were published by the system's creators, SNK. Not all of them. There were third parties, major ones of the 80s and 90s like Data East and Technos, who published games on the hardware, but most of the software came from the platform's architects. However, folks outside SNK's internal teams often made games that would end up published by them. Probably most well known among these is Nazca, a team of former Irem developers who created the SNK-published Metal Slug. And teams like Saurus and Yume Kobo were technically separate companies, though they were wholly owned by SNK. Enter Palace and Galapagos. Almost nothing is known about Palace, except they're credited on 2 games, both for the Neo Geo. 8-Man, based on the anime of the same name, and this one, Super Baseball 2020. Near as I can tell, with some help from the Game Developer Research Institute, they just owned the rights to character designs. Based on credits, seems Galapagos actually developed the game, but we don't really know anything about them either. They worked on the original Samurai Showdown, and that's about it. So yeah, a very little history as it turns out because we don't know anything about who made this game. But let's not let that deter us as we dive into a preview of this coming summer with Super Baseball 2020 on the SNK Neo Geo. Well, I'm not sure SNK and Palace got it right, because I've been watching the rosters so far this offseason, and I don't see any robots. Or women, for that matter, though who knows, maybe someday. At any rate, I'm playing the Neo Geo AES or home version. I did take a look at the arcade or MVS version, and aside from a 3-minute timer that prompts you to drop in another quarter upon expiration, nothing is different. Same goes for the Neo Geo CD version, which is not one of the games in that format to feature new CD music. Now by this time, neither Future Baseball nor Baseball in the Neo Geo were exactly new concepts. Super Baseball 2020 was released on the Neo Geo arcade format in September of 1991, and the home version came the following month in both North America and Japan. In the interest of being thorough, the CD version hit Japan only in February of 1995. But Baseball Stars Professional, developed in-house by SNK, hit the Neo Geo in the summer of 1991, and Konami's Base Wars hit the NES in North America only that summer as well. But just the same, this game was the first and last to fuse Future Baseball and Neo Geo Baseball, so props for that, I guess. For the most part, it's your fairly standard arcade baseball game. There are 2 international leagues with 6 teams each and just 1 stadium. Each team has a notable stat, which almost all of their players favor. I tended towards one of the American teams with high hitting stats. Now the wrinkles the setting provides are similar to what you might expect, though if you want the kind of fights Konami's Base Wars provides, you'll have to stick with that game because there are no fisticuffs here. The biggest deviation from standard baseball is honestly the field itself. In the far-flung future of this coming summer, foul territory has been reduced to more or less directly behind home plate, and it takes a straight jack shot down the middle to get a home run, because most of the audience is under glass, and the ball rolls back into play when hit over the fence. Additionally, there are jump zones and stop zones. The jump zones are strategically placed near the fence line and give your outfielders a boost to theoretically make dramatic catches like a super-powered Lorenzo Cain. But in practice, in all the games I played across the versions, I never actually made functional use of the jump zone. The stop zone will stop the ball dead in its tracks if it hits one, which can easily cut a double or even a triple down to a single. Beyond that, you can augment your players with special armor that gives them boosts to specific stats. These are purchased with money earned during play. Everything you do, from a single to a strike to catching a fly ball, earns and loses money for your team, and during play, you can use this money for augments. But that's not where it ends. As the game goes on, the league adds landmines to the field, called crackers. These won't destroy your players, Mutant League style, but they will stop you from making a play, and as we get deeper into the ball game, more get added. By the bottom of the ninth, the outfield is downright treacherous. On an aesthetic level, whoever was at Galapagos knew what they wanted to do: make a spectacle. That's the name of the game in arcades, and this game features a bright early 90s color palette, huge sprites, and a bunch of detailed animations for different plays. The music is just okay, mostly inoffensive and not especially noticeable, good or bad, but the visuals are impressive. Sadly, like most games, it's not perfect. Now, the fielding can be a little weird, like your players stop moving in their tracks when they pick up the ball, and there doesn't seem to be a way to hit the cutoff man on a long throw. But the biggest issue I had with the game is the base running. Hitting and pitching, they work pretty well, at least by the standards of an arcade game, as long as you're not expecting the show or anything like that. But the base running, it's an unmitigated disaster. To begin, your base runners won't take any lead unless you tell them to with the B button while you're at bat. Now, that in and of itself can be frustrating, but it's not the worst of it. I wasn't able, not one single time, to send a guy or girl or robot back to the base they came from successfully. Not from the unexpected catch of a fly ball, not from a bad decision to send them around second, not on a hit and run gone awry. Never, not once was I able to send someone back. And apparently, it's not just me, because look at this. The computer player managed to get a player stuck at third and never sent him back to second. And this happened more than once. That sounds like a small thing, especially if you're not super into baseball, but seriously, the base running is so frustrating. I ended up just playing it very safe most of the time because taking any risk seemed to result in a massive punishment. And of course, since this is a 90s arcade game, that's compounded by the other big problem, a lopsided AI. The computer opponents are generally ruthless. Even when I started a game with a 3-0 lead in the first, by the end I was getting beat, seemingly just because the computer decided it was going to win. So it started getting an inordinate number of good hits. Whether they were bloop singles or massive triples that went, well, not just to the wall, but beyond it, and then eventually rolled back down over the glass. I mean, when it seemed like none of my players could leg out a single, theirs were blasting frozen ropes to every corner of the stadium. Overall, it's still a fun, interesting take on the game, but your best bet, if you want to check this one out, is to find a friend who is as into baseball and classic gaming as you are, and play it with them, because then at least you're both dealing with the frustrating base running controls. Now, the Genesis and Super NES were not nearly as powerful as the Neo Geo, everybody knows that, but SNK wasn't stupid, and they realized that the market for the AES was limited, so there are a ton of ports of Neo Geo games to those two systems. So let's move on to Super Baseball 2020 for the Super NES, and see if it's twice as super, or if it's like a double negative kind of thing. Released March 12th, 1993 in Japan and the summer of that same year in North America, this one came 2 years after the original game, courtesy of Monolith Corporation, who should not be confused with Monolith Soft or Monolith Productions. According to the Game Developer Research Institute, it's possible Monolith Corporation was an internal group at SNK who specialized in Super NES development, though they were actually responsible for 2 Japan-only Neo Geo Mahjong games. But most of their output in their short life was SNES ports of Neo Geo games. Which, honestly, is a bit odd in this case. If they were, in fact, internal SNK, I find it very strange that they changed so much of this game for the Super NES, as this port is less faithful than the next one we'll be getting to. The graphics are reasonably faithful, all things considered, and all the teams are here, but it's missing a few things. Most noticeably, a bunch of the jump zones are just gone. Now there's only one, and it's right in front of the home run area adjacent to the center field fence. Perhaps even more disruptive, the crackers are removed. Yeah, they're just gone. It's not a huge deal, I guess, but they're part of what gives the game its unique feel, and in other versions can lead to high-scoring innings towards the end of games, since it's tough for the fielders to move around the outfield without exploding. But even without that stuff missing, this version is the weakest of them because the controls feel bad. It's tough to describe bad controls, as a lot of other people have pointed out before me, but I gotta try. Not only does everything feel sluggish, the fielding is made a lot tougher because I somehow managed to throw to second when trying to throw to first multiple times. And look, if it was bad before, the base running has somehow gotten even worse. It defies explanation, but take it from me. Do not try to steal. Do not send anyone unless you're sure the ball won't be caught. Just do not do anything on the base path ever. Ever. Not so super after all, huh? But Neo Geo ports were often flawed, so let's move on to the Genesis port published by EA of all companies and see how it stacks up. Yeah, you heard me right. Published by EA, because sports, I guess, and developed by NewFX, who would eventually become EA Chicago. It feels bizarre to say this, but this American-developed and published port, which did eventually make it to Japan a year after its 1993 North American release, is more accurate than the one purportedly developed by an internal group at SNK for the Super Nintendo. The crackers? Back. The jump zones? Back. And all this stuff could certainly be, at least in part, down to the similarities between the Neo Geo and the Genesis. While the Neo Geo had some additional horsepower in there, both systems did use the Motorola 68000 processor alongside a Z80 coprocessor. Now the place where this pretty clearly falls apart is the visuals. The Neo Geo, being arcade-centric hardware, was big, bright, and flashy. And while the Genesis easily outdoes any console that preceded it, the Neo Geo can show more than double the number of colors on screen at a given time than the Genesis has in its total available color palette, even if you include the shadow and highlight mode variations of those colors, which doesn't really count in my opinion. But just the same, from a playability perspective, it's exactly what it says on the tin. Super Baseball 2020. Honestly, the only issue I had is that when a lot is going on the field, it can chug a little bit, but the slowdown isn't remotely game-breaking, and it still controls better than Monolith's SNES port. While it's probably easier to play the Neo Geo version given its current availability from Hamster on modern systems, if you're a big Genesis fan, check this one out. I really wish I had more to say, but it is that faithful of a port, so let's go ahead and do like we always do and take a look and a listen side by side. As I said, the Neo Geo was really pushing the envelope in 1991, so aesthetically, the other two simply can't compete, but they both really give it a shot. The Super NES has admirable results, but the Genesis falls quite short of the audio-visual majesty of SNK's machine. And that takes us to the bottom of the ninth, and time to give the edge. And I think it's pretty obvious that the Neo Geo original is where it's at. Although the Genesis version is a pretty competent port, the Super NES version is in the basement on this one. If you want to play any of these games, paradoxically the Neo Geo version is actually the easiest one to come by in today's market because it is available as part of Hamster's ACA Neo Geo Archive series on the PS4, Xbox One, PCs, and Nintendo Switch, and in all those places it is a mere $8. If you do want to check out the 16-bit versions, bear carts of that generally are in about the $10 orbit for both Genesis and Super NES. If you want real Neo Geo copies, same as it always goes with Neo Geo games. The Neo Geo CD version is not that expensive, 30 to 40 bucks for this one. The arcade version is a little more expensive. You're looking, I want to say, in about the $100 range right now for this game, if you want an MVS cart. And the AES home version is prohibitively expensive. You're talking about probably in the $200 range or more, depending on the condition and all that stuff. And that's just the way it goes with Neo Geo collecting, so maybe your best bet is just to get it on one of the modern systems as a download. Those hamster versions are very accurate. There's not a lot of flaws in the emulation or anything like that. And that does it. So, thanks for joining me to usher in 2020. Let's all make it a great year together, and I will see you next time. Hey folks, it's Joe. Thank you so much for watching. If you dug this show, do all the things YouTube likes you to do. Like, subscribe, comment below telling me your favorite arcade baseball game. If you really liked what you saw, consider supporting the show on Patreon. For just $1 per episode, you'll get early access to new videos and much more, including your name listed here with these fine people. If you want more Neo Geo Super Nintendo Genesis action, on the left you've got my video on King of the Monsters 2. And if you want more sports, well, the video on the right is my video on NBA Jam Tournament.